Well, today in Washington, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky are holding talks with European leaders standing behind Zelensky. And now on the negotiating table, there's this candy with a beautiful wrapper called security guarantees for Ukraine in the NATO style, but without actual NATO membership. This formula is being pushed by Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, after the Alaska meeting. He says that Putin agreed to allow the United States and Europe to offer Ukraine security guarantees in the style of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, but without Ukraine actually joining the alliance. And this is exactly the wording the Americans are trying to promote right now. American media report that the Russian president agreed to the guarantee as part of a future deal. It certainly sounds interesting, but let's check what's inside this candy and see what's hiding there. Is this really an equivalent of Article 5 of the NATO Charter, or is it just another empty promise? I'm Alexei Pechi. It's August 18th. Let's review everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. Let's begin with what Article 5 of the NATO Charter is. In NATO, it's not just an oath, it's a mechanism. An attack on one is an attack on all. And then the logistics that are already planned, headquarters, air and missile defense systems, intelligence cycles, budgets, parliamentary procedures, funding, and so on, all come into play. In alternatives without joining NATO, all of this needs to be assembled separately from scratch, and all the mechanisms must be clearly defined. That is, who signs these guarantees, who ratifies them. It is the United States Congress that must make the decision that Ukraine will receive such guarantees outside of the NATO bloc. Will the European parliaments accept all of this? What is the duration of this equivalent of Article 5? How is the process automated? How is the assistance triggered by a phone call or by some kind of sensor? Something has to work. And the entire alliance understands that now the very security guarantee clause that we're being promised should come into effect. And what exactly is included in these guarantees? Is it promises? Is it money? Is it weapons? Is it quick protection of Ukrainian airspace? Is it sanctions against Russia? Or what is it? That's what's in this package. So far, all of this just sounds nice in the fog of war. And now Steve Witkoff is talking about agreement in principle. As he says, Putin has basically agreed for Ukraine to receive such guarantees. But in principle, that's not a legal term. The Europeans immediately set their own conditions. And in the statement from European Union leaders, there's a tough line. No restrictions on the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia cannot have veto power, and Ukraine must have ironclad guarantees. So guarantees can't be, exchanged for reducing the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces must never be reduced just because Moscow requests it. It can't look like we're reducing the Ukrainian armed forces the way Putin wants, demilitarizing Ukraine, and in exchange Ukraine gets some promises, some security guarantees. That's absolutely unacceptable. This is critical because Moscow is simultaneously trying to include a kind of, symmetry in the peace agreement. They say, let's forbid Ukraine, for example, from using long-range missiles, not just using them, but even having them in their arsenal. Let's forbid Ukraine from increasing the armed forces of Ukraine, and so on and so on. Supposedly, everyone will relax, but it's really just a chance for another strike. Russia will strengthen its potential over time, while Ukraine, will be left with nothing. Without missiles, without artillery, without an air arsenal, and so on, but there will be a piece of paper with guarantees. How does Trump see all of this? After meeting with Putin, the United States president is leaning toward the idea of a deal right away without a ceasefire and is ready to talk about guarantees as guarantees of compensation for giving up NATO and Crimea. Trump claims Zelensky could quickly end the war by accepting his terms. Agree and receive protection for Ukraine, refuse and get none. The problem is that protection should not depend on the wishes of the American president, but on laws, contracts, supplies, financing, and so on. Otherwise, it's not a real shield at all. It's just a shadow of some kind of shield. There's Article 5 of the NATO Charter. You have something similar. You look at the original and imagine that you have almost the same thing. What should an effective security guarantee package look like if it's outside the North Atlantic Alliance? First, the legal framework. bilateral and multilateral agreements with ratification and automatic activation triggers. For example, a ceasefire violation would automatically trigger an increase in arms supplies, certain types of weapons in specified quantities, regardless of the current political climate. Second, the material base. Long-term contracts for air defense, artillery, drones and missiles, joint weapons production in Ukraine and the European Union with secure logistics and maintenance. The third point is the Ukrainian sky. Permanent air and missile defense missions, at least in Western Ukraine, under the European flag, with the right to intercept any aerial targets. Fourth, a default sanctions package, firmly established. Breaking agreements automatically increases restrictions on Russian banks, energy exports, shipping, microchips, and more, etc. Fifth, the insurance economy. Government guarantees and insurance for investors who will invest in the reconstruction of Ukraine. So business supports peace instead of just watching. Is there a chance this will all come together? There's news, so to speak. Probably yes, if Europe and the United States agree to share the burden. But as many Western media outlets are writing today, Europe is not yet ready to replace the United States on its own. And the plan B, in case Washington wavers, looks shaky. So, operating outside of NATO only works if it is essentially NATO in substance. That is, joint headquarters standards, planning, depots, etc. But if the guarantees are just, excuse me, a piece of paper, a set of vague formulations, then it will all be Budapest Memorandum 2. And the Kremlin knows this. That's why, as Vitkov says, Putin so generously agreed in principle to this, because in principle it's just a piece of paper, not a guarantee. And finally, about mutual guarantees. Russian diplomats are already writing that if Kiev gets guarantees, then Moscow should too. If Kiev receives security guarantees, Moscow should also receive them. On paper, it looks supposedly balanced. In reality, guarantees for Russia are actually ceilings for Ukraine. Restrictions? For example, the Russians demand not to develop missile capabilities, not to accept Western instructors, which is ridiculous, not to expand air defense. Air defense is defense, not offense. But the Russians say no air defense, no missile or artillery development, no NATO troops or instructors, and no progress on air defense. All of this is a trap. Security guarantees are not about disarming the victim, they're about making new aggression impossible. That's why this European statement that the Ukrainian armed forces must not be reduced under any circumstances is the key to understanding the situation. If they remove it, then this wording about being outside of NATO will just become a pretty shell. For what purpose? For Ukraine's disarmament. This has happened before. Unfortunately, in the early 90s, they took away the nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees. And so they've been acting for how many more than 30 years? So what? That didn't stop Russia from attacking? So, security guarantees should be in addition to a very powerful and strong Ukrainian army, but not instead of it. So I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Thank you all. Goodbye, everyone.